In the Torah portion of Devarim, we begin, first verse says, these are the words which Moses spoke. And interestingly, we're beginning a new book, of course, the book of Deuteronomy. The Talmud indicates that the entire book of Deuteronomy was said in a different prophetic voice to the previous four books. These are the words which Moses spoke, as opposed to the previous four books which were spoken directly by God. The first four books being virtually a dictation word for word by God, where the fifth book being, as the Tosafists explain, said with divine inspiration, of course prophetic inspiration, but through the mouth of Moses, they were composed with some influence of Moses himself. They went through the mind of Moses, and he didn't just act as a direct conduit who didn't provide any of his own input. Now, what is the significance behind this? So the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy of Prague, a 16th century teacher who often draws from mystical sources, explains the distinction between the first four books and the fifth book as follows. He says, if you want to give someone a present, you want to give them a gift, it's got to be meaningful for both sides. You don't give a child a Rolls Royce as a present. They won't appreciate it. On the other hand, the gift that you give has to be an expression of you. It can't just be some meaningless gesture. So a gift always has something of the giver and something of the recipient as well. The Torah is our gift from God. So therefore there has to be an element, a layer, a dimension which is, so to speak, God's side, sympathetic to God, the clauses which favor him. And there has to be a layer, an element which suits the people, which is more geared towards the people. And the Maharal calls this the Geder HaNoisein, the category, the level of the giver, and the Geder HaMakabel, the part of Torah which relates more to the recipients. The first four books being God's side of the Torah, so to speak, and the fifth book, since it came through the mind of Moses, represents more our element of the Torah. So what does that mean practically? It means that spiritually, when we read the fifth book, the book of Deuteronomy, it's actually empowering us more to take the light of the Torah and deliver it into our daily lives in a practical way. And that is why Deuteronomy, of course, means the repetition of the law. So much is repeated in the fifth book, which was there before. Even the Ten Commandments later on in next week's Torah portion, we see the Ten Commandments repeated. What is the point of repeating things in the Torah if it's this perfect book written by God? So the answer is that it's repeated in a different voice, a more human voice, to empower us to bring the Torah to our human lives in a more meaningful way. Let's move on to verse 5. In verse 5, we read how Moses began to translate the Torah. He explained the Torah, and Rashi comments that he actually translated it into 70 languages. What was the point of this? I mean, surely all these Israelites didn't speak 70 languages, so it seems to be a pointless exercise. So Rabbi Isaac Meir Alter of Gur, 19th century Chassidic Rebbe, explains that Moses translated the Torah into 70 languages because he wanted it to be that wherever Jews would find themselves, they would be empowered to have Torah teachings in the vernacular, in their own language, and therefore it would give them the inspiration and the strength as something that felt contemporary and relevant. But there's actually more to it than that. There's an even deeper insight. And that is that Moses translated the Torah into 70 languages, not only for the people's sake, but for the Torah's sake also. Why? Because supposing you get out a Torah book, but it's written in English, and you start reading it, are you doing the mitzvah, the commandment of studying Torah? Or perhaps, because it's not written in the original Hebrew, you're not fulfilling a commandment at all. You're doing something which is already a step away from real Torah study. Moses translated the Torah into 70 languages so that whatever language you would learn the Torah in subsequent generations, it would still be Torah. Torah translated remains Torah. It isn't some sort of offshoot or secondary derivative. It's the real thing. Now we also have an insight that the Torah can be interpreted on many levels. We have, of course, the classic distinction of paradise, which literally means paradise or orchard. It's an acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, which means the literal meaning, allegoric meaning, interpretive meaning, and mystical meaning. All Torah can be interpreted on these 4 layers. If you go deeper than that, we have the classical idea that Shivim Ponim LaTorah, that every Torah idea has 70 facets to it. There's not one monolithic interpretation. There are 70 possible interpretations. But the Kabbalists went even further. The Kabbalists said there are 600,000 possible interpretations of every verse, which sounds like a lot. But actually, shouldn't there be an infinite number of interpretations? Why do we have to limit it to 600,000? Why can't we just say there's unlimited potential for interpretation here? So Rabbi Isaac Lurie explained that there are only a limited number of original souls. Even though there have been many, many millions of Jewish people, there were originally 600,000 core souls. And your soul is a spark of one of those 600,000. But there's only 600,000 original core souls. Now, when you think of a fresh idea and innovation, a new insight, a new slant into a verse, it's really your soul speaking to you. Your innovation, your fresh ideas come from your chachmah, from your ability, your wisdom, your ability to innovate. And therefore, if there are only 600,000 souls, then we have to conclude, by definition, there are only 600,000 possible interpretations of any single verse. And that explains, said Rabbi Isaac Lurie, this peculiar statement in the Talmud, that every innovation that any future person was going to make was already given to Moses at Sinai. Now, is that possible? Could Moses possibly have? I mean, there's tens of hundreds of thousands of volumes of Torah literature which have been written over centuries. Could Moses in 40 days possibly have learned and studied all those interpretations? So the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Lurie explains, it was in his soul. Moses had what we call a general soul, which means his soul encompassed a little bit of all those 600,000. So every innovation that was going to be introduced in subsequent generations was already in Moses because it was in his soul. There were only 600,000 souls, of which Moses had all of them in microcosm, so therefore he had, by definition, all possible future innovations somewhere stored in his soul. Spiritual message for the week. You know, I like to think, we're starting a new book now, the last book of the Torah. I like to think that the 5 books of the Torah are kind of our journey in life. Bereshit, the book of Genesis, really deals with a lot of kind of primal conflicts of jealousy, of hatred, of competition, which kind of relates to our youth when we're struggling with very strong emotions. Then we have Exodus, liberation. That's a little bit like adolescence when you finally have your own independence and you can live your own life. Then there's Leviticus, which is all the laws of sanctity, because as soon as you reach your adult life, you realize if you're just going to be a narcissist and follow all your urges, then life's not going to be very meaningful. You need some sanctity in life. Then we have the book of Numbers, which is all the journeys in the desert, which is really kind of the extended adulthood, the midlife, that period where you're just living your life and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, the ups and downs. Finally, we get to the book of Deuteronomy, and here we're looking backwards. Moses is looking back. It's the end of his life. He's looking back at the last 40 years. The message of Deuteronomy is this ability to have the wisdom of old age, even in early life, to look back with a kind of expanded awareness of what we've done in our life, to evaluate it, to have a wider perspective. And that's what we're really being granted this week. So try and focus on that. Try and find some maturity in your soul, some way of looking back on your achievements with a little bit more maturity than normal, and realizing the good that you've done to propel yourself even further. Thank you for listening. Join us again, please, next week for Torah in 10.